Welcome to Artist3D. My name is Alan, and in this week's video we'll be looking at making this amazing Space Marine figure from OpiumClay Studios. This model is available from the Patreon of OpiumClay Studios at the moment as one of their models of the month for November. I'll leave a link in the description below. I highly recommend you check them out. Now, if you've ever wanted to add LEDs to a head and didn't know how to hollow it out, stick around and I'll show you how to do that using nothing more than lychee slicer. Now, I had something of a disaster with one half of the base plate. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but as it took 17 hours to print, I thought I'd try and repair it rather than reprint it. I began by gluing the two halves together with 5-minute epoxy. The two halves were held together with a large headband. This held them together nice and tight but didn't damage their models or distort them. I decided to use Milliput and fill the hole and then wait for it to harden and then file it down and sculpt it. The benefit of using Milliput is that when it hardens it produces a rock hard finish which makes it easier to sand and to sculpt. I filed and sanded down the excess Milliput and then sculpted it with a metal sculpting tool to get some detail back into the surface. I gave the model parts a primer coat of Vallejo Primer Black. This would help to hide any blemishes and imperfections in the base. I gave the concrete blocks a zenithal highlight with white primer and then set about painting them with Army Painter Filthy Cape Grey as a base coat. I then used a Vallejo black wash to darken down the shadow areas of the concrete. And I added in some colour to the concrete with some rusty effects with smoke from Vallejo. I used the dark brown smoke wash to bring some colour to the concrete and also to accent the rusty areas of the concrete around where the rebar would be. I then painted the rebar and the exposed metal beams with the same dark brown smoke. I added highlights of Army Painter Ash Grey to the concrete with a dry brush just to pick out the highlight edges. And I used Tamiya Brown Panel Line Wash to accentuate the colour variation of the concrete and to add some depth to the colour. The panel wash helps to break up the uniformity of the concrete and also to provide some detail and interest in it. I added some fine highlights to the rebar with Vallejo rust and just dry brushed it on. All of the skulls and bags were given a zenithal highlight with Army Painter Matte White. Painted the base podium with a gunmetal silver colour to give it an industrial look and to make it look sort of worn and heavy. Magnets, lots of magnets in fact. I think I used about 40 magnets in this build in total. The method I've developed to stop them from falling inside is to put a sort of cage of supports behind each magnet hole in lychee slicer. I make each magnet hole 0.1mm bigger than the magnet itself, and as the model shrinks when it's cured, it makes a nice tight fit for the magnet. I gave the chainsword a base coat of gunmetal silver, which will act as a nice contrast to the chrome teeth later on. For the alien skin, I gave it a base skin tone mix of Brain Matter Beige and Prue Pink. For the alien's crown I used Vallejo Nocturnal Red. It's a nice deep rich purple colour. And for the inside of the mouth and tongue I used Tamiya X27 Clear Red. It finishes with a nice gloss finish when it's dried, which is perfect for a blood effect. I used a Vallejo purpley brown for the long claws as a base colour, and then mixed it with black wash for the low shadowy areas. I dry brushed the highlights for the crown and the claws with a nice bright squid pink, and then gave the crown a nice sheen with a Citadel Nuln oil finish. I gave the alien skin a diluted wash of transparent red, diluted down. This was worked in 2 or 3 coats to give the dark recesses a nice deep rich red compared to the pink skin. And now one of my favourite things to do is blood effects. I do this with a Tamiya Clear Red splattered from an old toothbrush. You have to be quite sparing with the blood, less is more sometimes, and it's easy to get way too far into it and overpower the paint job underneath. I wasn't too sure about the eye colour, so I went with a nice bright yellow as a contrast to all that red, and then I picked out the edges of the crown with a matte white. I didn't want the alien skin to be too bright, so I toned it down with a nice wash or two of Cygor brown and just left it hanging in the recesses. Now I bought 4 different shades of Humbrol blue all at the same time, but none of them have a name, so I ended up using this one, number 1930, and ended up mixing it with Vallejo Magic Blue for the Marine's armour colour. The Marine satchel bags were painted a base colour of Hull Red by Vallejo. This gives a nice rich deep reddish brown leather effect when it dries. Now it should be no surprise that the skulls were painted bone white, and then I shaded them with smoke brown from Vallejo and used a panel wash brown from Tamiya and dabbed off the excess with a damp paper towel to lift off any that I didn't want. Next up, it's the same 2 blues combo that I used to paint the armour, this time for the shoulder pads. The text inlays on the shoulder pads were darkened down with a black wash by Vallejo. I painted the dark recesses in the text on these shoulder pads first, as it's a lot easier to do that first and then do the edge painting with the lighter colour on top. I experimented with the gold paint and I found it doesn't like having a black wash applied on top, it just tends to lift it off, so I decided to underpaint with black and then edge paint the gold on top. I mixed in some white ink to the 2-colour blue combo for the armour for the highlights. I used a dark blue wash from Vallejo to darken down the helmet colour. Now you may remember that I mentioned earlier that the Marine's helmet was split in half. This was to enable me to incorporate the LEDs and also the magnet holes. And this is how you do it. In Lychee there's a function to slice a model, but if you want to include a magnet support holes, you'll need to hollow it out before you slice it. You need to make the hollow depth more than the diameter of your magnets. I used several 2mm by 2mm magnets, and so the helmet was hollowed out with a 3.5mm depth wall. Once hollowed out, go to the slice function button and line it up with the plane that you want to cut it with. Click apply and it does it for you. For the 2mm by 2mm magnets, I made the holes 2.1 by 2mm. This ensures that you get a tight fit when you press the 2mm magnet in. The 2mm deep holes ensure that the magnet holes don't go all the way through. Next I cut 3mm holes for the LEDs and a small 2mm hole in the back of the helmet for the 2 wires to exit to go towards the backpack where the battery would be. I decided to freehand paint the white and red stripes on the helmet as it was too much of a pain to mask it. This took a couple of coats of paint to do. I then painted the eye sockets red to hide the red LED eyes. I painted the side breathing pipes gunmetal and then with an outline of steel, and the skull on the front of the helmet was painted steel silver as well. I used the Vallejo black wash to add a shadow effect to the arm chains and also to any armour shadow areas. You'll probably notice at this point that the gold and the gunmetal areas in the chest armour are already done. This is because I painted the whole model the wrong shade of blue to start with. My mistake. I had then done the gold and only have to do the blue again. The gold and the gunmetal will get done again later due to this overspray. For the shoulder armour, I painted a base coat of matte white underneath the red leather and the bone white, as neither would cover the blue very well. As with all these things, you might need to do more than one coat as it doesn't cover all in one go. Both the skull and the scroll will both eventually be getting a coat of bone white on top. For the leathery effect, I used a mix of bloody red and gory red, and it looked just right in there, I think, even if I do say so myself. Next I went over all the armour pieces, adding more depth with a dark blue wash from Vallejo. For the chainsword teeth I used one of my favourite paints, Molotov Chrome Silver. This stuff is really nice and only needs one coat and produces a nice chrome finish. I used Vallejo steel for the edge wear and highlights over the sword to pick out wear and damage with a dry brush. This is also the same approach I used for the edge wear on blue armour, in combination with the black wash to emphasise the darker parts. You just want to pick out highlights here and there and not all over the place, otherwise it looks a bit heavy-handed. Here I'm using a black wash which is very diluted, and this is just to emphasise the differences between the edge wear and the shadow areas on the sword and on the armour. I use a damp paper towel to lift off almost as much paint as I put down with the dark wash. This process is done in many stages. For the edge wear and tear, I use a fine tip brush and steel Vallejo paint. You can always lessen the effect or smudge it with your finger to produce nice effects. I did a couple of passes with Vallejo rust and also with dark brown to produce the dirt and grime in the areas of the chains and armour. And after the rust pass I did another edge highlight with steel. I used a slightly darker colour for the armour steel parts with a phantom grey steel mix. This was just to give it a nice contrast from all the steel parts. Next I used a Vallejo dark blue wash applied with a damp sponge to produce a weathering effect on all the blue paintwork. You can be quite heavy-handed with this because it produces a nice effect and the sponge lifts off almost as much as it puts down. I gave all the blue armour parts a thin coat of satin gloss varnish to give it a more believable paint finish and also to protect the paint job from the weathering that was going to go on top. Next up was one of the many dirt washes with black and rust diluted to make it like a very light pass. Most of these were lifted off with the sponge, so there was lots of layers. As you can see, it's just layer after layer, and then sponge, layer, sponge, repeat. And it's the same process basically all over the armour and the chains. The dirt washing is particularly good for accenting the edges that the steel edgeware will go over later. And it's another thin pass with the satin varnish just to bring back the shine in the paintwork, being careful to try and avoid the dirty areas. And at this point I now go back over the gold with the Decacolour gold paint. This is due to all the overspray that I caused when I painted the gold too early. And I do the gold on the shoulder armour areas with an edge paint technique to try and emphasise the dark parts in the gold. And to give the pledge scrolls a nice worn look, I paint them with a bone white. And as you can imagine, the edgeware on all the armour pieces took quite some time. This is just a small sample of what was carried out. One of my favourite parts of this model was the damage and edgeware to the armour, telling the story of the battles that he's been in and trying to make it look like it's been chewed up by various aliens. Basically, you have to imagine that the damage has been caused and left rough edges that have caught and taken the paint off. I used this Chroma Air magnesium paint for the first time on this model, kindly given to me by Spray Gunner. I'd actually like to thank Daniel and the guys at Spray Gunner and Warwick at Harder and Steenbeck for helping me out when I had an issue with my airbrush. Both were extremely helpful and got me back airbrushing again in no time. Thanks very much, guys. I used a dark flesh tone brown for the dirt pass on several parts to give it a different tone from all the rusty brown bits. I applied it with a damp sponge. Painted the cloth parts with Army Painter Ash Grey and then darkened it down with Dungeon Grey and dry brushed blended between the two. I used Vallejo smoke for a dirt pass over the cloth to give it a well-worn, dirty look. And I painted his utility belt with a dark flesh tone just to make it different from the bags that would go attached to it. Another one of the blood passes, this one of the highlights of the kit, all over the chainsword and up his arm and on his shoulder and his feet. I really went to town on this part, I must admit. I just love the random effect that you get from splattering it with the toothbrush. It's just something that you can't really recreate with a paintbrush. And next it was on to the second version of the heads. This one is Titus with a white zenithal highlight. And next up is a Warlord purple, which gives a nice deep undercoat underneath the flesh tones, followed by a pass with transparent red in the shadowy areas before beginning with the first of the flesh tones, with medium flesh tones sprayed from a low angle. I applied a lighter base skin tone next from a high angle, only when you do it try not to get it this thin. I had to go over the head with the orcish dermis just to add some colour back into the skin colour. And the top highlight skin tone to bring out the highest areas was a Proof Pink by Vallejo. I used some Reikland flesh shade to give him more of a weather beaten look, almost like if you had a tan, and then gave a base coat of black for his hair. And I'm just picking out the high areas of the skin with a very diluted basic skin tone, and then lifting off any excess with a damp paper towel. And I did the lips and scars on his face with orcish dermis. And I chose to do the head studs with a bright bronze by Vallejo. And I did the highlights in his hair with a dry brush of phantom grey. And with more steel edgewear on the helmet this time for Titus. And I gave the helmet a final coat of satin before doing the edgewear on it. You can see the red and white wires going into the backpack, where I had mounted the 2 watch batteries and a toggle switch to turn his LED eyes on and off. And finally, the base just needs the weathering and the gold for the eagle on the front. I highlighted the stonework with Filthy Kate from War Paints, and then applied a null oil pass to give it a bit of colour before the Decacolour gold. And with that, I'm calling it done. I really enjoyed working on this model, and I can only apologise for how long it took. Unfortunately, I was unwell for a while, and I was also very busy with work. But I plan on making up for it with the next video, which hopefully won't be as long this time. So if you could drop a like and subscribe, that would be great. And until next time, this has been R2-3D, and I'll see you in the next one.